At last they arrived at Guer, a village on the southern bank of the great Zab River, just 30 miles from Mosul, the terrorist group's Iraqi capital. The Islamists' forward position lay less than half a mile away. The Kurds were winning here, steadily reclaiming territory they had lost months earlier to ISIS. But the campaign was constantly being slowed, the Kurdish officer said, by poison gas weapons that ISIS was now using with astonishing regularity. Since the first chlorine attack in January, the jihadists had moved into more frightful terrain, blister agents. These consisted of a kind of sulfur mustard that was loaded in large mortar cells and lobbed directly into Kurdish fortifications. Later, ISIS added chemical laden artillery rockets to the mix so they could fire from longer distances. More than 100 cells loaded with mustard or chlorine had been hurled at the Kurds in the space of a few months. The attacks had taken a toll. Fewer than 5 people, all of them non combatants, had died, but hundreds had been wounded, including dozens of fighters who suffered searing chemical burns after being splashed with the cell's oily brown contents. Where the liquid touched the victims, their skin erupted in painful blisters, some as big as golf balls. The psychological injuries were worse. Most of the fighters were old enough to remember the massacres of the 1980s, when Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein used sarin against Kurdish settlements, killing more than 3,000 people. Decades later, the very mention of chemical weapons evoked fear and dread among many Iraqi Kurds. My lads and lassies don't like chemical weapons, the Kurdish general told the Breton Gordon as they walked. The battlefield visit was still underway when the general learned of a fresh skirmish further up the line. There's an attack going on over there, he said, pointing. The small entourage climbed into vehicles and rushed toward the action, arriving in time to witness a volley of mortar fire coming from the opposite river bank. Cells began landing about 600 yards from where the Breton Gordon was standing, but they weren't exploding exactly. There was a muffled pop, followed by the emergence of a cloud of greenish smoke that began drifting in the Kurds' direction. In all his years of training, de Breton had never witnessed a chemical weapon fired with harmful intent. The sight was mesmerizing. The day was perfect for a chemical attack. Clear, with a light breeze, he recalled afterward. What was fascinating was you could see the downwind hazard. It was about 30 to 40 meters wide and maybe 30 to 40 meters long, moving with the wind. I was excited. The Peshmerga thought I was loony. The vapor was beginning to disperse as the men watched, so the Breton Gordon tried to reassure the Kurds near him. We're all going to die, one of the fighters said mournfully. No, the British weapons expert replied. The danger will be gone by the time it gets here. How do you know? When the greenish yellow stuff disappears, it's gone, he said. It's not sarin or something that you can't see. With the nearest American outpost miles away, there was no one close by to call in an airstrike, so the men just watched quietly as the gas plume thinned and then disappeared altogether. No one had been hurt, but the effect on the Kurdish lines was as profound as though the defenders had suffered a direct hit. It's a horrific thing to see someone die from a chemical weapon, the Breton Gordon said afterward. The Kurds can tell you about the thousands of people Saddam Hussein killed with chemical weapons in Halabja and in 40 other chemical attacks during the Iran Iraq War. Everyone in that area knows about chemical warfare. For the Kurds, it's absolutely in their psyche. How did ISIS obtain the weapons? The Kurds could not say. Obtaining chlorine was no problem, as the industrial chemical could be found in Iraqi factories the terrorists now control. But what about sulfur mustard? Had the terrorists stumbled upon abandoned munitions from Saddam Hussein's time? Had they managed to steal something from Syria's stockpile of poisons? Some answers began to emerge in the following months as delegations from the OPCW arrived in Baghdad to investigate the reported attacks on Kurdish forces at the Iraqi government's request. The investigators swabbed yellow residue from recovered mortar fragments and tested the greasy soil in the spots where the projectiles had landed. They interviewed Kurdish soldiers and examined the ugly scars left behind wherever the foul smelling liquid had touched human skin. They examined one soldier whose legs were utterly covered with chemical burns, from his waist to the crisp line at mid calf, where his army boots had offered some protection. The lab tests and interviews yielded a confirmation and also a surprise. The oily liquid in the mortar cells was sulfur mustard, no doubt, but it differed from the kinds of military grade blister agents the OPCW's experts were familiar with. Its formula was relatively simple, even crude. It lacked enhancers and stabilizers that military weaponeers typically use, which meant that it tended to break down more quickly when exposed to the environment. It was neither Syrian nor Iraqi, judging from its chemical composition, yet it clearly had been made by someone with access to modern laboratory equipment, a working knowledge of toxic weapons, and a grasp of basic chemistry. All the signs pointed in the same alarming direction. Somewhere in Iraq or Syria, ISIS was manufacturing its own chemical weapons. The terrorists had not yet mastered all the elements, but they were learning.